Is dedicated anonymously for the refuah shlema of Oksana bat Bluma and Evelina bat Galina. Bezras Hashem, may they have a refuah shlema b'toch shar OUisrael. There's a lot of stuff here, but I believe that's the only one that's relevant for this year. Okay, thank you. Alrighty, so we're still in Igeret Teman, which is also called Mamar Petach Tikva. And you'll recall that the Rambam is addressing many, many issues, and the particular issue that he was addressing at this particular point in the letter was the false Moshiach, or some guy who claimed to be Moshiach. And as a result, many Jews were led astray. And the Rambam addresses this from various perspectives. And the perspective we looked at last week was the problem of Chishuv HaKetz, trying to calculate the Messianic date, because some people argued, based on their calculations, that this is the right time. And the Rambam goes through the whole idea that this is called a Davar Sasum. This is something that is mysterious, and many people are going to make mistakes. And the Chachamim discouraged the calculation of the Ketz based on various verses. And there was even a kind of very, very strong expression, Tipach Rucham Shel Mechashvei HaKetz. Tipach Rucham literally means they should explode, meaning their soul should leave their body. Those who are Mechashvei HaKetz, because again, the Rambam says, number one, it's not knowable, and number two, you raise people's hopes. And when those things don't happen, they get totally demoralized, and therefore it's better to basically say, we of course believe there will be a Geula, 100%. We believe that, but we don't know when, and we're not supposed to give specific dates for it. Then you'll remember, just to remind you a little bit, that after the Rambam said that, he then proceeded to give a tradition in his family, not for the coming of Mashiach per se, but for the restoration of Nevuah in Klal Yisrael, which at some point is going to be a precursor to Mashiach. So I don't want to review the whole thing, but let me just mention it quickly because it actually is in this week's Parsha, and that is from the prophecies of Bilam, when Bilam declared, Ko'etz yeyomer liYaakov ma po'al kel. And the way the Rambam's tradition was, Ko'etz, when a time has elapsed from now, equal to the time that has elapsed up to this point, yeyomer liYaakov, it shall be declared to Yaakov through prophecy, the Jewish people, ma po'al kel, this is the famous phrase, what hath God wrought? Samuel Morse, when he invented the telegraph. Now, here is the interpretation, meaning Bilam is actually saying, prophecy shall return to the Jewish people when the number of years that elapse from this event will be equal to the number of years that elapsed up to this event. Ko'etz, when a zman like this time has passed. And the Rambam makes a cheshbon. We can figure out what year of Briat HaOlam was Bilam's prophecies, simply because we have the famous date of Avraham Avinu was born in 1948, and when Yitzchak was born, when Avraham was 100, so Yitzchak was born in 2048, and we know Yetziat Mitzrayim was 400 years from Yitzchak's birth. So that gets you, Yetziat Mitzrayim, 2,448. Bilam was the 40th year in the desert. So that's 2,488. Okay, so 2488 is the year of Bilam's prophecy. 2,488 years have elapsed from the creation of the world. Bilam is declaring, when another 2,488 years elapses, prophecy shall be restored to the Jewish people. So you simply add 2488 with 2488, and you get whatever you get to 4,900 something. I don't have the number in front of me. Suffice it to say, that date has long passed, but the Rambam's interpretation was, not his interpretation, but the Masorah that he had from his family is that that date would be, it's around the 1200s, somewhere in the late 1200s, would be the restoration of prophecy. So, as I indicated, the anomaly of right after the Rambam tells us we shouldn't be doing these calculations, he does it. I think you see what a strong Yetzer Hara there is, that when you want to give comfort to people, you want to give them hope, even though you really know that maybe you're giving them a false hope and you shouldn't do it. Okay. But after the Rambam gives this remez, he then proceeds to another argument that the Messianic followers were making, meaning their first argument was calculation. And there the Rambam addressed it with the problems of Chishuv Haketz. The second issue was astrology, that people looked at the Kochavim and they saw the various planetary positions, and based on the Chachma that was known as astrology, they came to a certain conclusion. So here, this is not as cut and dried as you might assume. The Rambam's position is fairly clear. The Rambam's position, but that's not everybody's position, is astrology is a bunch of hokum, it's a bunch of junk. Astrology has no validity whatsoever. One should not look at the Kochavim for anything. It is, as most modern scientists would say, it is a pseudoscience. And obviously, one has to understand, astronomy and astrology are, of course, two very, very different fields. Astronomy is the scientific study of planetary motions, rotation of the Earth, etc. And obviously, astronomy is not only a valid science, but astronomy is a necessary science for Jewish people, because the whole calculation of Rosh Chodesh and the calendar is based on astronomy. And the Rambam himself, as part of the Mishnah Torah, has a section called Hilchos Kiddush HaChodesh, the laws of sanctifying the new moon, and the first half of it are the halachos of witnesses and the like, but the second half, which a lot of people skip, is full of mathematical calculations, which underlie the calendar. If you want to feel bad, this is a part of the Rambam that's very difficult, unless you have a good mathematical background, which I don't myself. So for a mathematician, it's not a big deal, but for most people, it's very, very daunting. But when the Rambam introduces it, he says, I'm going to be very simple. I will give you calculations that every 8-year-old is capable, right? So I think there was a TV show or something. Are you as smart as your 8-year-old or something like that? Apparently, most of us are not as smart as the 8-year-old in the time of the Rambam. But that's even true in secular education. If you actually look, I remember seeing readers for public schools in the 19th century, readers, like second grade readers, whatever, really kind of much higher. In other words, like the second, of course, a lot of people didn't go to school, that's the thing. But those who went to school actually had a higher standard of education. The second grade reader would be equivalent today to a fourth or fifth grade reader. So, Niskatnu Hadoros, the generations going down, is not only true in Torah in many, many ways, although we're more advanced in a lot of ways, but that's because of the famous mashal that we are midgets on the shoulders of giants. Yeah, it's true that technologically we can do all sorts of things, but it's building on foundations of those earlier generations, yeah.
The contradiction, we know that every month has a mazel, and on the other hand, and mazel Yisrael.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about this. So the Rambam basically takes the position that although astronomy is certainly a valid science, but astrology, in which you use the positioning of the stars and the planets to predict future events, or even to describe personality types, the Rambam says is simply fake. It was an aspect of idolatry. It was idolatrous culture. But it's important to note that the Rambam doesn't simply say it's osur to do. The Rambam says it's worthless to do. That's a separate position. Now, the truth of the matter is, I do want to point out that even among the Rishonim at the time of the Rambam, there were many, many, many Rishonim, in common with most thinkers of the Middle Ages, who saw in astrology a very, very valid chachma. One outstanding example is the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra was a little earlier than the Rambam. The Rav Avram Ibn Ezra, as you know, was well known as a commentator, although he's very brief, on the Chumash and on many books of Nach. He was also one of the greatest grammarians, Balei Diktuk, and in fact, in his commentary on Nach, a lot of them are Diktuk comments and the like. And the Rambam, I don't know if the Rambam met the Ibn Ezra, I have to look at the dates, but the Rambam refers to the Ibn Ezra as one of the very few rabbis that the Rambam mentions by name, and usually in a fairly non-critical way, meaning I wouldn't call him a fan of the Ibn Ezra. He doesn't like say, oh, the Ibn Ezra, somehow said something, therefore it's conclusive, but he referred to him in a, civil way, so to speak. But in addition to the Ibn Ezra's biblical commentaries, and in addition to his books on Diktuk, he wrote separate, besides the commentaries, he wrote several books of Diktuk. The Ibn Ezra wrote maybe 10 works on astrology. And the Ibn Ezra was absolutely convinced that astrology was a valid chachma, and it can be used for the future predictions, at least in a general way, and as he understands the Torah's prohibition regarding very specific predictions. But in terms of general tendencies, he considered it to be valid, as well as personality. Now keep in mind that even if you assume astrology is valid, you then have to ask yourself, well, which astrology? Meaning, that doesn't mean the modern day horoscopes mean anything. Meaning, that's another issue. Meaning, im timsa lomar, astrology has validity. You then have to go through the very difficult process. What is valid astrology and what is quackery? Let me just say that the Ibn Ezra's astrological systems are not necessarily the same as Jean Dixon. I don't know if she's still around. Probably not. I remember her when I was a kid, when I was a kid, so I'm sure she's not around, but whoever took her place in the horoscope columns. But the Ibn Ezra has 10 works on astrology, and you can actually go to a website like HebrewBooks.org, which has all these free swarm, and you could actually find them. So the Rambam, in a sense, is being a little independent here, meaning although the Rambam is stating what most of us would regard as a common position, that astrology is worthless, the Rambam was bucking a trend. Both non-Jewish philosophers and many Jewish philosophers considered astrology to be very valid. Now, if we go back further, though, and we ask ourselves, well, let's go back to our sources. Let's go back to Chazal. Let's go back to what the Gemara says. Well, it's very, very hard to deny that the Talmud has many, many references to astrological phenomena. The Gemara in Masechet Shabbos says that the personality of a child may well be dictated based on the planets under which they were born, meaning when a certain planet was dominant, which is whatever that means exactly, but that's a very common astrological idea that certain planets control certain times. So I'm sure you've heard the well-known Gemara that says, he who is born under Ma'adim is the red planet. The red planet is, of course, Mars, will have a nature to be shofech dam, to be a bloodshedder. Can't change that. That's going to be his nature. He will have bloodlust. That's unchangeable. But what is changeable is how he chooses to direct his bloodlust. He can become a murderer, or a shochet, or a mohel. Though I have to admit, I'm not sure if I like the idea of a mohel who has bloodlust. I wouldn't necessarily consider that to be the ideal characteristic, but in that way he could get his bloodlust out by that. Which means the Talmud seems to indicate that astrology is a reality, but you have the ability to channel or sublimate or the like. Now, if you remember with Avraham Avinu too, the Gemara portrays Avraham Avinu as an astrologer. And Avraham Avinu looked at the Kochavim, and he said, based on the Kochavim, which influence the things that happen on earth, I will not have a child. I cannot have a child. And when it says, Hashem lifted him above the stars, HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to him, do not look at the Kochavim. Your destiny is above the Kochavim. Now, again, that's saying two things. On one end, it is saying that Jewish destiny, or at least Avram's destiny, is not governed by the stars. And that's the meaning of Ein Mazal Yisrael. The Jewish people are not governed by Mazal. But on the other hand, that is implicitly recognizing there is such a thing as Mazalot. In fact, even the greeting, somebody said that, he was at a chasna, he was enjoying the smorgasbord, and a relative of the chassan went by, so the person said, Mazel Tov. So he said, I don't appreciate using idolatry, at a chasna. Even Mazel Tov. If you would have said Mazel Tov to the Rambam, right? You were at the, right, Rav Avram ben Rambam's bris, right? And you were Zocha to be at the Rambam's only son's bris. Okay? You give the Rambam a Mazel Tov. He might kick you out of the house. You're an idolater. Mazalot, astrology, Mazel Tov, may things be under a good constellation, right? So it's very difficult to say that Chazal didn't consider astrology to be valid. And once we come to Kabbalah, the Zohar, astrology is used all the time. Every month has a particular constellation that influences the spirituality of the month. And not only that, Chazal teach every hour. We don't even know astronomically what this corresponds to, but astrologically, every hour of the day is governed by a planet or a kochav, and it goes over and over. It's a repetitive cycle. So the Rambam would simply not follow any of this. That's one of the reasons we call the Rambam the rationalist par excellence. But I remember, for example, that the 6th hour of the day on Erev Shabbos, on Friday, meaning between, actually the 7th hour, it's the 7th hour of the day, between 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. If you calculate the planets, the stars, and the hours, so between 6 and 7, Friday evening, is governed by the planet Madim, the red planet. And that's considered to be a bad sign. It's the planet of blood. So many Hasidim, based on Kabbalah, have a Messiah. They will not make Kiddush between the hours of 6 and 7 p.m., even on an early Shabbos, because that hour, based on the calculations of the planets and stars, is Mazel Madim. I know this halacha firsthand. When I was a law student in Boston, so I was able to spend many Shabbosos with the Boston Rabbi, Zechron Levrach, Rabbi Yitzchak, a wonderful, truly a wonderful person. Just as a little aside, if you were on a phone conversation with him, he was never the first one to hang up, meaning even if the conversation seemed to be finished, he would just wait till you said you had nothing more to say. That was kind of the person he was. So Boston, of course, has many college students, many graduate students, very large student population. So he would often have at his Shabbos table, 100 students. That was routine and the like. But the thing was, he would never make Kiddush between 6 and 7. So I remember if davening was over 5:45, there was a mad rush. We're gonna run, because if Kiddush is not made by 6, we're gonna have to wait till 7. And to get 100 people ready for Kiddush when there's only 15 minutes left is not such an easy thing. The Rebbe himself wasn't rushing. He didn't mind waiting an hour, but we were rushing. We wanted to get to the table. And yeah, I remember sometimes we made it, sometimes we didn't. There were times where indeed it's 6 p.m., got to wait, no Kiddush till 7 p.m. The point I'm making is that there's a whole aspect of Judaism that looks at mazalot, that looks at planets, that considers them. Now again, Ein Mazal Yisrael is still valid in the sense that through prayer and Ma'asem Tovim, we can always escape the influence of Mazal. But Mazal is at least a default setting, as opposed to the Rambam, who says it's non-existent. So many people point out that although most of us do not learn Kabbalah, but all of us live Jewish lives that are based on Kabbalah, meaning it's not necessarily the Judaism of the Rambam. The Rambam would give no significance to hours of the day being governed by different mazalot. As I say, the Rambam wouldn't even allow the statement Mazal Tov, which is a statement that is based on constellations and planets. So if this entered Judaism, so to speak, it entered it via Kabbalah through Hasidus primarily, meaning Kabbalah influenced, Hasidus is based on Kabbalah, and Hasidus in a sense kind of permeated even non-Hasidim. Yeah.
What would be the alternative to saying Mazal Tov?
Yeah. The question was, if you don't consider Mazel Tov to be a permissible bracha, what would be the alternative to Mazel Tov? You could say Baruchim to you, different things. May you be blessed, whatever. We're used to Mazel Tov. What do Svardim Mazel Tov? What do Svardim say? I don't remember. Did they say Mazel Tov? What are they? Chazaku Baruch. Mabruk, say? Okay, Chazaku Baruch, right? Because Mazel Tov essentially is an Ashkenazi thing, I think. Mivorach. Okay, just contract. Same things like that. Yeah. That Mazel is Seichel? I'm not sure. I mean, I will say that Rashi quotes in a few places an earlier person, Reb Shabtai Donello, who was an astrologer, and Rashi quotes astrological ideas from Reb Shabtai Donello from Italy. So it's important to know that although we might look at the Rambam as mainstream here, the Rambam was actually not mainstream at the time, and he was very independent in this. And as I say, mainstream Jewish culture is actually, in our mind we say astrology is nothing, and yet in our rituals and in our language, we actually utilize astrological concepts. Now, I just want to point out that the Rambam does talk about the fact that Chazal refer to Kochavim, but the Rambam says, as he says in a number of other places, that Chazal are using the vocabulary of common superstitions to communicate deeper spiritual truths. Which means, according to the Rambam, Chazal themselves didn't believe this stuff, but in order to communicate, and I'll give you an example in a moment, in order to communicate spiritual teachings, they employed the types of superstitions that were commonly accepted. So an example would be this. Let's take the Gemara I just mentioned. He who is born under the planet of Mars will have a bloodlust personality. Now the Rambam would say, in a literal way, that's an incorrect statement, because it really makes no difference under what planet you're born. Nevertheless, this passage of the Talmud actually has a very profound meaning, and it's a meaning that's relevant even today. The Talmud is dealing with the problem of how do you reconcile that within the human personality that is unchangeable and hardwired versus the capacity of choice. Now, in the olden days, they believed the part of you that was hardwired was based on astrology. Today, we don't believe that. But we have another name for it. Call it DNA. DNA. You're born a certain way. So the fact that they use the vocabulary of astrology, of Kochavim, and we might use the category of DNA, it raises the same dilemma. How can a person have free will if they're born with certain tendencies? It's almost not important if those tendencies come from astrological influences, or those tendencies come from biochemical parts of the body. The problem is you're born a certain way, and this is a real challenge. As we've mapped in recent years, it's already been more than 20 years, as we've mapped and sequenced the human genome, more and more we see how many aspects of even our personality. Of course, every mother always knew this, but now we have the scientific basis. How much of things are we born with? Right? You could be born with the anger gene or whatever it would be. And philosophically, this raises challenges to the paradigm of free will. If I'm born with the anger gene, I'm born with the axe murderer gene, whatever it is, how can I be accountable? Remember, the Rambam says over and over again that free will is the necessary predicate for accountability. If we did not have free will, we could not be held accountable for our deeds, and we could not be rewarded for our virtues. And the Gemara in Shabbos is giving you the answer to this. Yes, there is a certain aspect of biological determinism that exists in the world.
Wouldn't that be, we say, Yitzchak comes into play and what we have to deal with our entire lives?
Yeah, but the point is that this is a little different because it's not like there's an equal contest between two forces. I mean, you're born with these biological problems. So what does the Gemara say? You can sublimate, you can channel, you can direct. So you see what's going on here. Yes, Chazal employed the vocabulary of Mazel. But this vocabulary was employed to make a larger point that ultimately does not turn on whether you believe in astrology or not. I could say, okay, whenever you see the word astrology or kochavim, just read it as DNA, and you'll get the same analysis. And that's what the Rambam doesn't quite say what I said. He doesn't mention DNA, but the Rambam's point is that the Chachamim were willing to utilize metaphoric, superstitions of people, even if they weren't true, if they were vehicles to communicate a higher point. And therefore, you always have to look at what the higher point is. But in terms of bottom line, in terms of the messianic issue, the Rambam is saying, if you're looking at astrology to predict Mashiach, that's garbage, because astrology is garbage as a whole. Now, let me indicate an interesting thing. Just this week, I got an email from a guy who had learned in Or Sameach, and he was I don't know if he's a Talmud of mine, I don't remember exactly, but he's a Ben Torah, a frum person, and he opened. He's a therapist or something. I think he's a life coach. He's not a therapist. He's a life coach who tries to build people up. And he was telling me that he's so excited because he developed an exciting new way to help people, in which he combines AI, artificial intelligence, with astrology, and he can create all sorts of maps about how a person needs to respond. He was very enthusiastic about it. He, of course, wants to have a meeting to discuss it. I still don't know exactly what to do about that, because there are two separate questions here. Question one is, are you halakhically allowed to utilize astrology, even if it's valid? And here we get into a very interesting issue. Many poskim say you're not allowed to use astrology at all. It's forbidden. It's considered to be an aspect of idolatry. But other poskim are mechalek. They make an interesting chiluk. They make a distinction between using astrology to predict the future, which is considered idolatry, and using astrology to analyze personality. So, if I use astrology to say, you're going to lose your job tomorrow, that would be forbidden prediction. That would be magic. That would be necromancy. But if, on the other hand, I say astrology indicates that your nature is such and such and such, so that's legitimate, just as Chazal talked about, born under the Mazel Madam. So as a result, even though the Rambam seems to consider both to be garbage or worthless. But in halacha, there may be a basis to use astrology to augment personality construction, as long as it's not, and then suggestions, kind of a therapist augmentation, as opposed to prediction of the future. But the second question is, what astrology are you using? I mean, even if astrology would be permissible and even valid for certain aspects, but that doesn't mean, modern astrology or whatever it is would be valid. That's a separate issue about the empirical value, meaning it might be quackery if it's not done according to the guidelines of Chazal or Kabbalah or whatever it is. But certainly, according to the Rambam, all of this is going to be forbidden and worthless. So, I don't know. He didn't quite ask me for a haskama, and I'm not going to bring it up unless he does, and then I'll have to confront. He didn't ask me for, people like to get letters from rabbis saying it's kosher, and I don't want to write such a letter, but he didn't directly ask me, although I'm pretty sure that's coming down the pike. But right now I'm just holding my breath and hoping for the best. But he's very excited about it, and who knows? And in fact, there are actually books out there on Amazon called Kosher Astronomy, based on Kabbalah, Sefer Yetzirah, and the like, all of which the Rambam would consider to be heresy and the like. Now, the next, but in terms of Yigeret Teiman, the Rambam is pretty simple and straightforward. This is worthless, this is junk, and it should not be relied upon at all. Now, what's interesting is, though, it is very fascinating that after the Rambam debunks astrology, he then demonstrates how thoroughly he knew it. It's very interesting. The Rambam knew the wisdom, or the pseudo-wisdom, of astrology. At the same time, he disparages it. And he then goes on and he illustrates with various astrological phenomena why they were not accurate, why they did not work, but he clearly understood those phenomena. It's actually very similar to the Rambam's approach, Right, that's a good point. The Rambam makes the same point about idolatry, avodah zorah. The Rambam writes in the Guide to the Perplexed, and maybe with some hyperbole, that he had read every single book ever written about idolatry and paganism, and that is why he's in a position to refute or to demonstrate why it is incorrect. So the same thing here, the Rambam was very familiar with astrology, and here he brings up a very, very interesting idea. He's really addressing the argument of the supporters of the false Mashiach. He talks about, and even in modern astrology, this is very powerful, he talks about the conjunction of the planets Shabsai and Sedek. Now, these are the names the Chachamim gave to planets. Shabsai is Saturn, and Sedek is Jupiter. And obviously, they have different orbits, right? They have different orbits at different speeds, but conjunction is the point at which they, over time, they pass each other. They're the closest to each other. And now that alone is an astronomical fact. Conjunction is the mitzias of planets with differential orbits going past each other at various times. But astrology gives a special significance. And this is true even today, if you look this up. Astrology gives a very special significance to the conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, that somehow that conjunction brings certain spiritual forces down into the world. Again, I have no idea why, but Dafka, those two planets, but those are the two planets that create this type of force. Now, the nature of the spiritual force they bring down depends in what zodiac sign the conjunction occurred, right? We have 12 so-called signs of the zodiac, and once again, that simply represents positioning of stars, groups of stars. And because there are 12 signs of the zodiac, again, I'm giving you some astrology from the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't believe any of this, but the Rambam still analyzes it to refute the point. The 12 signs of the zodiac are divided into 4 groups of 3, meaning, let's say, whatever the signs are, groups of stars. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And each of those four groups are connected to one of the four elements of water, fire, dirt, and wind. Again, I don't have the exact table which is which, but here is the astrological concept, not the astronomical concept. It depends where the conjunction takes place. If the conjunction takes place within the three constellations that represent dirt, there will be a time of poverty and suffering in the world. If it takes place in the conjunction of water, there may be floods. Fire may either be destructive or may be passion. In other words, the point basically is the conjunctions occur within various constellations because the planets move. So at different points, they may be in this set of constellations or that set of constellations. So the person who's making the argument that since Mashiach is described as fire, etc., so therefore the conjunctions are occurring in the zodiac signs that are connected fire, and this is a good time. So the Rambam knows all this, right? The Rambam says, yeah, this is what you're telling. You're making this argument and this argument and this argument. And the Rambam basically went back and he calculated that in the time of Yaakov Avinu, in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, the conjunctions were in the constellation of dirt, and that should have been the lowest point for the Jewish people, and yet these were times of redemption. And so he actually went back and did the calculations, and he showed. Now, interestingly enough, you can learn this two ways. This may not necessarily refute astrology. It may be an illustration of Ein Mazal Yisrael. In other words, whenever you see that the Jewish people are not affected by Kochavim, there are two different ways you can interpret that. You can interpret that to mean astrology is junk, or you can interpret it to mean astrology is valid, but just like Avraham, Hashem lifts us above the stars. Those are two very, very different approaches. One is conceding the validity of astrology, but saying that God can transcend it. The other is saying there's no validity to it in the first place. The Rambam uses it for the latter interpretation. So I thought it was fascinating. It's actually a little hard to follow in the Igeret Tema that the Rambam actually devotes several pages to describing the conjunction of the planets and depending in which series of zodiac signs they appear, and the belief that this influences the future. And interestingly enough, this is still in modern astrology. You can actually read, just look up Wikipedia or whatever, and you can actually see this discussion about planetary conjunctions and the like. Okay, but again, in terms of Igeret Teiman, the answer is fairly simple. Don't look at astrology to predict the coming of Mashiach. It is not a science. It does not give you valid information. Now, after doing that, he then addresses another issue, and that is, what are the qualities of a true Mashiach? Because he's simply addressing the idea that the person who is being held up as Mashiach simply does not meet the qualities. And he even gives a little mussar to the rabbi, because the rabbi who sent him all of these questions said, well, this man is a religious man. He keeps mitzvos. He has Yiras Shamayim. So the Rambam says, and that's enough to be Mashiach, you think? He keeps Shabbos. Well, that makes him better than Shabsai Tzvi, that's true. But still, he says, it is hardly a qualification. Well, let's put it this way, necessary but not sufficient. Yeah, it may be a necessary qualification. By the way, it's interesting, there were Jews, if I can give you something much later, who actually thought that Theodor Herzl might be Mashiach. They were so enamored with the idea that he was going to create a mechanism to bring the Jews back to Eretz Yisrael. Now, many Jews in the shtetl of Russia or Poland, didn't know anything about Theodor Herzl other than he was the guy that was talking about bringing the Jews back to Eretz Yisrael. So there was a belief among some people, I wouldn't say it's tremendously widespread, that Herzl was Mashiach. So so when Herzl was in Vienna, Herzl was from Vienna, but when he went back to Vienna, he was eating in a non-kosher restaurant, and a certain rabbi called over one of his gullible balabatim and said, "Okay, you believe Herzl is Mashiach?" He says, "Yeah, I do. He says, "Do you think Mashiach would eat at a non-kosher restaurant?" He said, "Of course not." So he took him to the restaurant. He pointed, "Well, Herzl is eating in a non-kosher restaurant. Do you understand that you're wrong?" He said, "Yeah, I am wrong. I guess Mashiach can eat in a non-kosher restaurant." Again, by the way, I did not tell you this story to knock Theodor Herzl. Again, Theodor Herzl, in many, many ways, did a lot of good for the Jewish people. I'm not here to bedafka insult, but just to indicate that it's fairly clear in our tradition that at a minimum, Mashiach has to be halachically observant. But the Rambam says, hey, man, that's not enough. Just because you're from, that doesn't qualify you to be Mashiach. And he talks about the Mashiach has to be a Navi that is almost as great as Moshe Rabbeinu, meaning the Rambam didn't want to go to the direction there can be a greater Navi. Remember, one of the Rambam's 13 principles of faith is there will never be a greater prophet than Moshe. But he says Mashiach is a close second. And he indicates, and now this is very interesting, he indicates that Mashiach will do great, great miracles. And the nations of the earth will acknowledge him as Mashiach, etc. And he says he will do miracles similar to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, I think we may have to, we have to stop, but let me just throw out a question you can cogitate over the next week. And that is, in Hilchos Malachim, in chapter 11 and 12 of Hilchos Malachim, where the Rambam describes the Messianic age, the Rambam goes out of his way to say that although that's wonderful, there'll be a Beis HaMikdash, there'll be Kibbutz Golios, there'll be peace in the world. But the Rambam makes the point, it will not be a supernatural, miraculous existence. Olam keminhago noheg. You're going to still have to get a job. You're going to have to wait for the buses. And when the light rail in my neighborhood is down for 14 weeks, that's still going to happen. The Rambam says that all of the psukim that the wolf will lie down with the lamb are metaphors. It does not mean that wolves are not going to prey on lambs. So the Rambam specifically says Yemot HaMashiach is not a time of miracles. So the question I want to leave you with, and we'll talk about it, is, well, is this a contradiction? Igeret Teimani specifically says that one of the characteristics of Mashiach are the great miracles that he will perform, similar to Moshe Rabbeinu when we left Mitzrayim, when in the Mishnah Torah there actually is no mention of miracles. And not only that, but the Rambam specifically states, Olam kiminhago noheg, and one should not assume there will be miracles. I mean, world peace is a miracle. I mean, those miracles we have, but there won't be supernatural miracles. Now, one possibility, of course, is that Igeret Teiman was written before the Mishnah Torah. Did the Rambam change his mind? Well, it wasn't that many years different. Igeret Teiman was written shortly before the Mishnah Torah. But that's one thing we'll talk about next week, whether Yemot HaMashiach is connected to miracles or whether it's Olam Kiminhago Noeg, and how do you address the contradiction between Igeret Teiman and that. By the way, one final thing I'll tell you about, he mentions as an aside, and this is fascinating. He says, contrary to what people believe, the so-called wars of Gog and Magog are not pre-Messianic wars. They are post-Messianic wars. That's a big chiddush, and that means even after Mashiach comes, there are going to be certain cataclysmic battles until Mashiach is accepted. But we'll talk about that next week. Have a good week, everybody, and take care.